There you have it. Episode 22 of Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation's second season. Happy Father's Day to everyone out there. There's all likelihood they planned this out, that they were going to have this episode on this day, and it was going to be as much of a gut punch as we all assumed it was going to be. And I can honestly say this episode, although very tragic, and I'm very surprised they managed to fit in the double whammy. This is obviously a double whammy situation. You have the loss of Paul, and then right after that you have Zenith. And it was a double whammy, just a straight double whammy when I read it, and it was a double whammy when I actually watched the episode. Now, I do feel like there's a side of me that feels like the later part of this episode, it felt like they were trying to kind of blitz to get to that second punch. And I do think that that's a little bit of a detriment to the scene with Paul himself, because honestly, that scene, while not extremely long in the novel series, had quite a bit in there with Rudeus' mindset of why did this happen? Why did this happen? And that's also going to make it a little difficult for me to do a skip content area in that segment, because some of that stuff could be co-opted to the next episode, but I think it fits there. I honestly personally feel like it fits there. And there's much more they can get into with the next episode, and I really, really hope they nail it. This episode was fantastic, other than the fact that I feel a little bit like they were trying to blitz ahead at the later part of it. Obviously, hopefully, planning on getting a lot of that stuff in the next episode. I think the rest of the episode is great. I think the way they portrayed Paul being a total bad... Paul was just way too epic. And I got that sense in the novel series, too. He's just literally doing all this stuff, like using like centrifugal force to kind of slice this other one. He's constantly helping Rudeus the entire fight. Everybody is doing their part. And I really felt like the adaptation nailed that. Everybody is doing their part. And that was something that was being hit very heavy on the novel series, is how everybody was doing their separate thing and they were all working together. They were all pitching in on this overall goal. Additionally, yes, despite the fact that they used CGI on the Hydra, I think they did a really fantastic job with it. There was maybe 2, maybe 3 shots, if he really egged me on, that I felt was like a little bit off. But the rest of it looked fantastic, and I think all the closer shots, obviously not using CGI, looked really fantastic. They really did nail sort of the veracity of this thing. There's also this sense of like how long this is going to take. Like the fight itself just seems like it goes and goes and goes, which I think is a great thing that they decided to leave this to pretty much an entire episode is this one fight. So really fantastic episode overall. But with that said, let's get into my impressions/skip content video on episode 22. A lot of this is pretty much covered by the anime. It's pretty much one for one because it's mostly a fight. And it's much easier to watch it because it's obviously reading out every single step the characters take. The anime obviously covers it much quicker. But there is a lot in here with the mindset of Rudeus as they go along. And I think the more crucial parts, obviously, are that midpoint between the two fights. And additionally, yes, the aftermath. There is a lot in Rudeus' head in the aftermath. So let's just dive into it. Opening up the episode, obviously, they're standing before the circle and deciding what they're going to do. There is a quick moment of them asking, do we continue on or do we go back to the surface? Obviously, Paul is very excited to kind of go in and see what's going on in there, and so they do check their equipment and move forward. During the preparation, there's a few tidbits in there. One thing I think that they completely skipped, if I remember correctly, but yes, when Roxy is offering the scrolls to Rudeus, this is something that he does kind of jump on. Roxy had hidden a few scrolls in her bag just in case the need arose. They had advanced tier magic on them. She could dish out the spells quickly due to her shortening incantations, but advanced tier required lengthy chanting, so these scrolls were her hidden trump card. At that point, he decides to ask for some healing scrolls. He could do voiceless casting magic, but, of course, healing was another matter. It would be good to have them in case his throat or lungs got crushed again. He's still thinking about Orsted, when he fought Orsted and he just crushed his lungs and he couldn't chant anymore. And yes, that's kind of a big deal there, because if it's voiceless casting, he can cast all he wants. But he specifically lost, got his lungs crushed, so he couldn't cast actual healing. Healing is the one magic that he has not been able to do voiceless casting for. Roxy passed them over, and he tucked them inside of his robe. If he didn't use them, he could return them. Though, he wondered if he could have Nanahoshi or Cliff recreate them for him. He thought that it was forbidden to do that without permission. But maybe he wouldn't get caught if it was for personal use. It's not about just recreating them all. Roxy then said, I have no idea what kind of guardian we'll face, but we have plenty of firepower. I'll work as hard as I can to support you, so you don't have to use any of those scrolls. Please do. I can be a bit of a coward sometimes, so please help me out if I need it. Of course, you can count on me. She knocked her fist against her tiny chest. It was reassuring to hear. That's when Elinalise called out to them, tossing them marble-sized rocks. One of the numerous magically imbued crystals she carried. She said if you run out of mana, use those. He said, are you sure? Says, I'm just lending them to you. If you don't need them, hand them back later. Oh, sure, got it. It wasn't uncommon for magicians to run out of mana exploring Labyrinth. That's why they normally cleared enemies, retreated, rested, and pressed on. However, with a Guardian, Rudeus heard there's times that you couldn't run. Sometimes you'd find yourself locked inside of an arena-type area, unable to leave until the enemy was defeated. The circle looked like a two-way circle, but perhaps it was one way. They needed a way to replenish their mana if so. Yeah, that would have really sucked. That would have really sucked if they couldn't retreat. Everyone's expressions were pulled tight as Paul called out to them. Rudeus needed to get his game face on. Yes, that's when Paul decides to bring up a death flag. Or he's like, no, don't say anything. You can tell it to me when we get back to the inn. There's the first oof right there. There's the first punch in the stomach. Well, technically, that was one in the previous episode. Yeah, honestly, in the anime, when they stepped into the arena, it wasn't what I visioned with the actual novel series, but it's fine. They warped into a vast area, oblong shape, the size of a baseball field. Thick pillars at every corner, and a ceiling so high that you had to bend your neck backwards to see it. The floor was covered in tiles, each engraved with complex patterns. It was majestic. And yes, there was a monster at the depths of the structure. An enormous one, approximately the size of 2 red worms. From afar, Rudeus could see the twinkle of the emerald green scales, as well as the stout body and numerous heads that grew out of it. It was a Hydra. Yeah, of course, this is the point which Paul freaks out, seeing Zenith, immediately rushes out there. Which, yes, by the way, like I said before, the animation of Paul running up there and just going absolutely berserk. Everybody having to pretty much rush to keep up with him because he literally just charges in there completely out of formation. It does technically hint at the idea that obviously he's enraged because he's finally seen Zenith. The significance of this, and I think it does kind of carry over to the following scene, is really the fact that, again, Paul has been looking for Zenith for many years, like 10 years, I think, at this point. So this is my goal. I finally said everybody else he's found. He's found Aisha, he's found Norn, he's found Lilia, found Rudeus. He's found everybody else. This is the last of my things. And again, his entire time looking for every single person is constantly thinking, I'm going to find them dead. I'm going to find them dead. Or am I going to find their bodies at all? So finally, seeing Zenith, he can't stop. He just immediately rushes forward. But yes, the few things they kind of notice in this entire fight is the fact that every time a spell is casted, they hear a loud, ear-splitting noise, and of course, the spell itself disappearing. And of course, the fact that it's regenerating. The moment that Roxy's seen that it was healing, that was regenerating, that's the moment that she calls out for the retreat. Which I think is important because, yes, their spells aren't working, it's regenerating itself, we need to pull back and actually think about the situation. Yeah, Talhand called out to Geese, he rushed out there, puts out the smoke bomb, grabs Paul, yells at him to snap out of it. They immediately rush back. Rudeus casts his miss, and they get out of there. Now, here's where we're going to probably get into a lot of stuff that, unfortunately, the anime kind of glossed over. But yes, the moment they get to the other side, Elinalise was bleeding from her wound. A sizable chunk had been taken out of her. Rudeus didn't even see her take a hit, but apparently its outer shell was razor sharp. Basic healing sufficed. In his previous world, it would require a dozen stitches. Magic in this world was convenient. Obviously not convenient enough. Elinalise thanked Rudeus before Paul plopped himself on the ground in front of the magic circle, fixing his gaze on it. Murderous intent oozed from him like poison mist. Rudeus called out to him, "Father, that was Zenith. I'm sure of it." Paul hadn't even registered Elinalise's injury, but she was a tank, so you could say her getting injured was part of her job. Even so, please, calm down a bit. Yeah, that was my bad. I'm fine now. He was calm, but not cool-headed. He was right, though. It was Zenith. But why was she encased in there? No, the reason didn't matter. There was many potential explanations. Maybe the displacement incident warped her inside of it. It was rare, but not impossible. But Geese said that she was found by adventurers. The word used was captured. Does that mean Geese knew the condition that she was in? No, it was impossible. It wouldn't do them any good interrogating him about the framing of the information here. That could be for later, after this was over. That's when Rudeus said, "I wonder if she's still alive in there." Paul leaped to his feet. "What's that?" Grabbed Rudeus by the collar. "It doesn't matter if she's alive or not." "You're right." He had a point. That was inappropriate of him to say. Her survival was abysmal to begin with. Rudeus considered the possibility of not finding a body at all. Maybe just a memento left behind. Finding her this way was far better than they could have hoped for. Geese then snapped, "Enough of this fighting." Paul leaned his face towards Rudeus, as if to intimidate him. "Rudy, she's there. Zenith is there. Your mother. How can you be so calm? You would prefer I panic? How would me losing my composure solve anything?" "That's not what I'm talking about." Rudeus knew what Paul meant. He was being too cool-headed. His attitude wasn't appropriate for a child that had found his mother after 6 years. And again, you have to consider the fact that he hasn't been in Buena Village for a long time before then. But, well, Rudeus hadn't had much contact with Zenith since he was a child. He didn't have a strong sense of her being his mother. If anything, she was more like a person who had just happened to live with him. After all, he left the house when he was 7 years old. He hadn't seen her for almost 10 years. So maybe it wasn't entirely his fault for having a lukewarm reaction. Rudeus then spoke up. For now, let's just get on the same page about our current predicament. Paul let out a protesting grunt, but Rudeus ignored it and began speaking matter-of-factly. Our magic didn't work on that guardian. It has an incredible regenerative abilities, and its offensive strength is overwhelming that it broke through Miss Elinalise's defenses by brushing up against her. Then there's my mother, who's trapped inside of a crystal. Frankly speaking, we don't even know if she's alive or not. Paul yelled out, off. I already know that. I'm saying that's not the attitude to have when we finally found her. Geese then forcefully peeled Paul off of Rudeus. I told you, knock it off. You can squabble when we get back at the inn. Damn it, enough of this, Paul spat as he plunked down on the floor. Paul understood the situation already. He didn't need him to spell it out for him. It was Rudeus' attitude that he couldn't stand. Rudeus understood that he was being a bit unemotional, but what did Paul want him to do? Elinalise then clapped her hands together. All right, enough of the fighting. Now let's discuss. As they slowly gathered, Paul and Rudeus, taking their time, Roxy looked a bit flustered as she glanced at the two of them. It seemed that he'd worried her. I'm fine, Rudeus assured her. Are you sure? It wasn't the first time that it happened between them. Once this was over, Paul would come to his senses. Rudeus was sure that he'd feel something too once Zenith was safe and he could hear her voice. Like, can we put enough oops in one little segment right there? And I'll talk to Paul when we get back to the end. And once I hear Zenith's voice, I'm sure I'll feel something too. You're gonna feel something, Rudeus. This is kind of like that whole situation with the previous episode, or no, it was a couple episodes ago. Rudeus mentioned the idea that if what his regrets would be, he could possibly lose an arm or a parent. He flagged both of those. He lost an arm and he lost a parent. That's right. It had to be true. Things just had gotten a little off kilter is all. That's when Roxy brought up the state of Zenith, saying that there was something that they could do about it. She had heard occasional tales of powerful magic items encased in magic crystal. Once they defeated the Guardian, the crystal would liquefy, and they would be able to get her out of it. Or at least, that's what the story said. Elinalise then followed up, confirming it, saying that she knew a person that was once like Zenith, and that they were still alive. Rudeus figured what Elinalise said was a lie. She was the kind to smoothly spin a tale in these situations. He couldn't blame her, though. She was trying to ease the tension, but it didn't mean that Zenith would be fine. Not that he needed to say that. Everyone already knew that. Yeah, obviously the point here is that they have all traveled with Elinalise for a long time. They know, everybody else in the room has known Elinalise longer than Rudeus has. They all know what kind of person Elinalise is. She is somebody that is very good in tense situations to calm people down. This is something that she had to learn. Plus, she's been around for a long time, so she probably knows a lot of people. So it's kind of both ways there. And that's when they brought up the Hydra itself. Hydras were a type of dragon, a lone wolf with multiple heads and unmatched strength. Apparently, they inhabited some parts of the demon continent. There were 3 varieties, split up by the color of the scales: white, gray, and gold. There was no such thing as a Hydra with green scales. That's when Roxy spoke up about the Manatite Hydra. It was something that she read in a book. It's an infernal dragon whose entire body is covered with magic scales that absorb mana. It was spotted during the Second Great Human-Demon War, and according to the book, they were annihilated when the continent split. She was sure that was nothing more than a fairy tale, but it seemed to exist. She then knew that you can hit the Hydra if you hit it with spells point blank. It was huge and could carve you like a cheese grater if it contacted you with its body. Rudeus putting his hand up directly against it would cost him his fingers. Still, the problem Talhand brought up was of course the fact that it could regenerate itself. This was something that was extremely surprising to everybody, but not surprising to Rudeus. He knew that it wasn't invincible. Why? His knowledge from his previous life. So he spoke up. He recounted the tale of Hercules, who fought a Hydra, using a torch to cauterize the wounds. While just a story to Rudeus, the party's reaction was positive. While they didn't bring any torches along, mainly because Rudeus was using his lamplight spirits, they did have magic, so they would have to get point-blank range with the spells. Rudeus wasn't sure how similar the Hydra of this world was to the story. The myth said that one head was immortal, but maybe it could be defeated by burning each head. He didn't want to be too optimistic, but it was a living creature. Living creatures could be killed. It wasn't a guarantee, but there was no such thing as guaranteed success. Honestly, Rudeus felt like it would be best to go back to town and prepare more. Maybe hire adventurers that could slice the Hydra's neck. But Paul wouldn't allow that. In his current state, he would probably insist on charging the beast himself. Plus, if they went back, there was no guarantee they'd find somebody fit to fight a Hydra, or supplies to aid them. They had a countermeasure, and the people. Thus, they would proceed to battle. Geese then asked Paul, "Hey, Paul, you fine with all this?" "Yeah." "That's not much of an answer. You listening? You're the only one that can chop that thing's heads off." Paul was the only one that could do all the chopping, and with voiceless casting, Rudeus was the one to cauterize. Depending on the situation, Rudeus may have to close the distance and do it from melee range. While he was attacking the stub of the neck, The surrounding scales could nullify his magic. In that case, he would have to have others divert the attacks while he got in closer. Roxy would heal them if they took damage. Paul then expelled a breath and looked around to everyone. Elinalise, Talhand, Geese, Roxy. You've all helped me up until now. Years have passed since the displacement incident. You crossed the demon continent for me, searched out Rudy in the northern territories for me, went to lengths I wouldn't even begin to dream of. But now that's over. We'll either save her, or assuming she's not alive, at least all of my family will be accounted for. This is the end. Please, lend me your strength. One last time. One last time. It's a father right here. It's a Father Day again. Happy Father's Day. Elinalise was the first to speak up. It's not your style to act so humble, but I understand. I'll give this all I have. Talhand second. There's not an idiot here who'd say no after coming this far. Then Roxy. Let's win this. We'll be rewarded for our efforts once we claim victory. Paul was choking back tears. Rudy, he stammered. You are a really reliable son. You can flatter me after we defeat the Hydra. It's not flattery. I really do mean that. I can't be as calm as you. I can't come up with ideas either. I'm just an idiot who runs in head first without thinking. His lips wrenching, as if he was grinding his teeth together. I'm a terrible father. Can't even set a good example to my son. His voice was thick with conviction. He was staring hard at Rudeus. Eyes so focused that it felt like he was staring daggers at him. Determination. That was the word. Paul was full of determination. With that in mind, I'm going to say this to you. I know this isn't something a parent should say, but I'm going to say it anyways. All right? Save your mother, even if it kills you. This was a father talking to his son. It wasn't something a parent should say. It would be better if he said that he'd save her, even if it killed him. Still, Rudeus didn't think that he was a cruel father for saying that. This was his conviction and trust in Rudeus. Paul intended what he said. He would save her, even if it cost him his life. And he thought of Rudeus as an equal. He believed in him, seen him as an adult. That was why he said what he did. Rudeus had to respond. They were going to save Zenith. To that end, he and Paul would share the same determination. Rudeus gave a sharp nod, and Paul returned it. Rudeus thought he looked happy, though Rudeus couldn't be sure. With that, the rematch with the Hydra was about to begin. And that gets into the chapter Mortal Kombat, which I hate that title. I think it was a cheesy title. I really did like how the anime portrayed this entire scene. Again, there's a lot of that internal dialogue that's happening with Rudeus, but that's fine. It's not a big deal. I think the portrayal of Paul and his frustration with Rudeus was so well done. The voicing, the perspective shots of the characters looking up at them in different angles. You could just see the emotion that's in that room and how frustrated Paul is. I think the only thing they really didn't hit was probably the initial scene with Paul plopping down the ground. Again, he placed himself in front of the teleporter. He was ready to go back. And like Rudeus mentioned, it felt like this like poisonous hatred and murder intent is just oozing off of him. Paul was super angry. And I think they still nailed it as well. Like I said, the lighting and everything was just so perfectly played out there. The frustration with Rudeus. And I do like the fact that even though Paul's frustrated with Rudeus, because again, Rudeus has no feelings and attachment to Zenith. Again, he was like 7 years old when he got sent off from his home. And even as it says in the anime as well, during that time that he was living with them, she was just like a woman, a woman that was living with them. And again, disconnecting with his family, again, remember, Paul sent him off. And there's like a sense there, like, this is kind of your fault, Paul, because you sent me off and kicked me out of the house, sent me off to go train Edis. So, of course, I'm not going to have a connection to her. Like, I barely spent any time with her. It's really a sad thing there. It's like literally more than half his life was spent never even knowing her. So it technically makes sense. And I like the fact that eventually Paul sort of realizes, I wish I was calm like you, but I get too emotional. I can't think things through. And that's technically a lot of sword skills, is a lot of just kind of charging the enemy. The sword god style anyways. But let's get into Mortal Kombat. Yes, returning back to the boss's room and actually having a plan this time. An actual formation to go in there and attack. Roxy called out as everybody rushed forward. Just like planned. Rudy, can you do it? I got this. It's not like magic is the only thing I've been practicing. He assured her, although his heart was hammering. He wasn't good in melee, and all his memories were tainted with defeat. Paul, then Guillotine, then Edis, and finally Reincarnation. Sure, he won against Lilia, Persona, and Luke, and others using the Eye of Foresight, but could any of them defeat a Hydra? No, he didn't see how they could. Not when Paul and Elinalise were struggling. It was illogical to think he could either. But he wasn't alone. he had a team. He didn't know the extent of Talhand's power, but if he was comparable to the others, he would prove useful. He rushed in behind Paul. Elinalise was on his right, and Talhand was on his left. Behind Rudeus was Roxy, an Imperial cross formation. But yeah, that's when they rush in there, start attacking. They do the cauterizing. Cauterizing is working. Yes, I was actually surprised the anime actually had the Talhand fake out, which was honestly, I hated when I read it. It was like they had this whole Talhand fake out moment. Multiple heads came towards Talhand. He evaded the first one, but he was unable to evade the second one. He dropped and rolled trying to escape. As soon as he did, scales clipped him and his heavy armor went flying. His butt was firmly on the ground, and by the time he blocked the third with his axe, the fourth couldn't be defended against. It snapped at his feet. In a second, Talhand was suspended in midair. The fifth swooped in, jaws bared, threatening to snap his torso in two as he dangled helplessly. Then, a low boom resounded as a head hit the floor. The tragic, freshly stump of a dwarf's neck was nowhere to be found. It was the Hydra's head that had been lost, and Paul sawed it off. Yeah, like I said, that was like a total fake out, and they technically covered it, but it wasn't as, like, I guess, how do you pull that off? How can you actually do that in an actual visual form? As they continued, they got down to 3 heads left. Once again, the Hydra's movements changed, staggering back as if it was frightened by them. Paul called out to press the attack, but Rudeus' legs were frozen. Wasn't this a trap? Rudeus felt like the enemy was scheming, and that they shouldn't attack. The Hydra then began chomping at one of the burned necks. As the meat and bone knitted back together, Elinalise thrusted her Gladius in and casted Ice Smash. She then called out to Roxy, who unleashed a flamethrower. While the scales absorbed some of it, it still managed to shear the flesh. I really love that shot in the anime. Just her going up there and just stabbing down and just doing the entire incantation as she's being thrown around. There is kind of a nice use of the fact that Rudeus has voiceless casting. As Paul rushed in to pursue, the Hydra didn't retreat. Instead, it lifted its enormous body, stretching its heads just short of the ceilings, and glowered down at them. Was it afraid? No, it didn't seem likely. What was this? It felt similar, dangerous. It was drawing in air, and Rudeus knew what this meant. It's going to breathe something. Everyone, come over to me. Paul retreated a step, returning to Rudeus. Elinalise and Talhand came running, almost tumbling to the base of his feet. Roxy leapt towards Rudeus, with her arms spread, as if to grab on. I love they actually got that. When Roxy got out there and just boop. Rudeus conjured a wall of water, as thick as he could. Almost at the same instant, the creature exhaled a tremendous flame from the 3 heads. Enormous plumes of steam rolled out, heating the whole room. Dragon breath was renowned for its fearsome heat. It could melt right through steel or evaporate a small bog in an instant. And just now, 3 heads were pouring out that very breath. An ordinary magician alone couldn't defend against it. 5, no, not even 10 would be enough. Fortunately, Rudeus' mana wasn't ordinary. Rudeus then called for Paul to attack. The Hydra's breath had limited uses. Whether created by an organ or stored up mana, Rudeus didn't know. He just knew that it wouldn't fire in rapid succession. This had to be its trump card, something it could only unleash with 3 heads at the same time, probably to avoid catching the other heads in its path. It's totally like an RPG. It's playing almost like a JRPG or something like that, with like, here's the next phase, here's the next phase. This was their chance. Paul ripped through another neck, and Rudeus burnt it. Just 2 more to go, one thicker and one thinner. The thicker one was probably the main head, and Rudeus thought they should keep it for last. Rudeus called out to Paul to go for the thinner one. Elinalise and Talhand dealt with the thicker one. As Paul cut the neck, Rudeus seared it. They could do this, Rudeus told himself. 1 left. They won this. Even if the final one was immortal, they could deal with it now the others were gone. It was then, as he was using magic to cauterize the second to last stump, the Hydra's body trembled. Rudeus didn't know what this movement meant. He could see it with his eye of foresight, but didn't understand it. The creature was too big. You moron. Wait, before he realized what was happening, Paul had slammed him out of the way. Something enormous came crashing down right in front of his eyes. But he didn't have a head anymore. No, there was no head, but it still had a neck. The Hydra was slinging its headless necks around like spiked whips, all 8 of them, every one coated with scales that could shred flesh. It whipped those around all at once, mowing down anything in the vicinity. Paul screamed out to Rudeus, driving his foot at him to kick him out of the way. Almost simultaneously, a thud resounded as something smashed to the ground in that once empty space that existed between Paul and Rudeus. Horns jutted from the creature's forehead, and an eye was glaring at Rudeus. A panicked, cornered eye, one trying desperately to survive. The Hydra's eye. On instinct, Rudeus plunged his left hand into the eye. He could hear a squish like a grate popping, as a fierce heat consumed his arm. The Hydra blinked from the pain, its scaled-covered eyelids coming crashing down like a guillotine. In that instant, he launched a stone cannon, blowing off the top of the Hydra's head. The force of the collision jerked his arm into the air. A tear, then a vicious snap that penetrated so deeply into Rudeus' ears, it seemed to claw its way to his brain. Choking back the pain, Rudeus screamed out to Roxy, his trusted master. She unleashed a flamethrower, and the final head fell charred black from the fire. Its enormous body slowly collapsed. Rudeus could feel the life gradually drain out of it. The final head was not immortal. They beat it. They won. As Rudeus celebrated, a sharp pain shot up his left hand. Looking down, he was in shock. It was gone. The eyelid had cut straight through the skin and muscle, snapping the bone apart. In the last moment, as it raised its head, it ripped the whole thing off. Blood was pouring out. My left hand. His hand was in its eye. Glancing over, the raw power of Roxy's fire magic left a clump of charcoal. The moment he saw it, he knew his left hand was gone. He could search for it, but he wouldn't find it. He would bleed out if he tried. Crap. He needed to heal fast. He casted Shine Healing, an advanced tier spell. Advance alone won't restore what was lost, but he used it anyways. Pink flesh swelled over the amputated stump, ceasing the blood flow. The scratch on his face and the bruise from Paul's kick was also healed. His breath was erratic. Calm down, he told himself. His hand was gone, but the Hydra was an incredibly difficult foe. He got through it with all but his left hand. It was a small price to pay. If Paul hadn't managed to squeeze in there and save him, he probably would have died. You really saved me there, Father. He glanced over his shoulder, searching for him, but there was no response. Everyone was quiet. Elinalise just stood there. Talhand was silent. Roxy pursed her lips, and behind them, Geese was pale as a sheet. Paul gave no reply. Father? They were looking at something. He followed their gaze to Paul, collapsed on the ground on his back. He wasn't just collapsed. He was unconscious. His eyes were vacant, and his lower body was missing. Rudeus' brain couldn't process it. Wait, he knew what happened. That's right, he's seen it himself. Paul kicked him out of the way because the last head was coming down on that spot. He kicked him as hard as he could to move him. Rudeus wasn't a child anymore, so he had to thrust his entire lower body forward to have enough power. Normally, that kind of kick would send a person reeling from the recoil. But Paul was a swordsman, a skilled one who could wrap themselves in a battle aura, one with physical strength. So when he kicked Rudeus, his body didn't move. That meant the place that he was at. The place. No. He didn't want to understand. Rudeus muttered. But why? The moment he strangled out those words, Paul's eyes moved, landing on Rudeus. He met his gaze. Paul said nothing. His mouth just softened, as if relaxed, as if expelling a sigh of relief. A blood gurgled up on his lip. Then the light went out of his eyes. Paul was dead. No matter how many times I read this, it still gets me. Happy Father's Day. Paul was relieved that Rudeus was alive. Like I said earlier, it still kicked me when I seen that moment in the anime. It hurts. No matter how you put it, it still hurts. And I think the moment that hits me the most is there's a shock value to it, obviously. Looking over, everybody's shocked. And the moment that Rudeus goes over there, it really kind of cements it the moment that you have the smile. The smile from Paul's face, that relief in his face as he kind of fades away, that's what hits it. And obviously anybody that has ever, unfortunately, has seen that moment where that almost a life leaves the person, it's so painful. Obviously, for me, recount my own experience with my father passing away. It's not easy. Every time that moment that you see that last breath being drawn. Okay, we're good. We're good. When the Hydra breathed its last breath, the magically imbued crystal liquefied. Yeah, it didn't shatter, by the way. It liquefied. Zenith collapsed on the ground, alive, still unconscious, but breathing. There was dozens of enormously magically imbued crystals in the area, and the ground was littered with magic stones that comprised of the creature's scales. Further in was a plethora of fallen magic items as well. All would net a fine price. but none of the party was in the mood to collect them. Rudeus felt light, unsteady, as if in a dream. If someone called out to him, he would reply, but his mind was otherwise empty, almost as if someone else was answering for him. Yet he was able to make short work of the tasks that remained afterwards. They cremated Paul's body in that room. His feelings about it was complicated. Part of him wanted to take him home, at least let Zenith see his face. But in the end, Rudeus followed everyone's recommendation. His fire magic reduced him to bones in minutes. Elinalise warned him that burying him like that would result in reanimating as a skeleton. So he did as she proposed, crushing the bones down and conjuring a jar of earth magic and pouring them inside. The only thing left behind was his breastplate, his new left sword, and his favorite sword he held since before Rudeus was born. Rudeus felt strange. He couldn't put his finger on what this emotion was. He felt like a weight was crushing down on his chest. He wasn't much use on the way back. They beat their enemy, and he used magic, but his feet were unsteady. If it weren't for Roxy pressing close beside him, he might have stepped on a trap. No matter how many mistakes Rudeus made, no one said a word. No complaints, no consolidations. Everyone was at a loss for words. Zenith was carried the whole way and never woke up. It made Rudeus anxious, but the fact that she was breathing meant that she was still alive. At least, that's what he tried to tell himself. Yeah, this is about the point which is really trying to cement the fact that, yeah, obviously, with Paul's death, the hope there is at least Zenith is saved. At least something good comes out of this. That's why it's obviously already going to be a double whammy, but it is a double whammy in the idea of not only did they risk their entire lives to save her, but is she even there anymore? Is she just an empty husk? Obviously, Paul would still want to save her, even if he said that, even if she's dead, he wants to retrieve her body. It took them 3 days to exit the labyrinth. Back at the city, Geese and Elinalise explained the situation to the others. Shiera collapsed in tears, and Viera sank to her knees with a look of shock. Rudeus couldn't say anything. He didn't say a single word. Lilia was different. She had a face of a mask, revealing nothing as she looked at Rudeus and squeezed her arms around him. Honestly, that part hurt me the most watching the show. I knew it was coming because I knew that Lilia was going to cover it. She said it must have been difficult. You did well. Try to get some rest and leave everything else to me. Rudeus felt empty and simply nodded. Returning to the inn, Rudeus shed his robe. He knew he needed to stitch the shoulder, but he tossed it to the corner with his staff and bag and collapsed on the bed. From this point on, some of this stuff can be sprinkled in the next episode. But like I said, I think it fits more well here because of the fact that we already covered in the anime going to see Zenith. So keep that in mind. This stuff could be partially covered there. That night, he dreamt of being in his old body, back to the slow-witted, self-demeaning shut-in. But this time, there was no man-god to be found, nor the white room at which he resided. It was a memory of his previous life. Unsure of when it took place, he at least knew it looked familiar. It was the living room of his parents' house. His parents were there, speaking about him, but he couldn't hear their voices. Were they worried about him back then? Rudeus left that world without ever discovering the reason for their deaths. Considering they both went at the same time, he assumed illness, accident, or perhaps ending their own lives. He wondered what they thought about him before they died. A shameless shut-in? Vexed about how he turned out? Ashamed of him? He hadn't a clue how they truly felt. His mother popped in occasionally, but his father at some point stopped saying anything to him. Did he ever cross their mind as they died? But Rudeus questioned himself. When they died, he didn't even go to their funeral. What was he even doing? He didn't even pick up their bones from the ash after their cremation, like a child should have done. What the hell was he doing? Why didn't he even go to their funeral? He was scared of the way that people would look at him when they seen that he wasn't even trying to be sad. Scared of the way they would look at that piece of shut-in, their hostility, contempt. But that wasn't the whole story, of course. He wasn't an honorable human being. At the time, he hadn't felt an ounce of sadness of their passing. He didn't love them enough to grieve. His concern wasn't their death. It was thinking, oh now what am I going to do? He couldn't even look directly at his own future. He didn't mean to justify his behavior, of course, but he also couldn't help it. Imagine being backed into a corner, losing the last source of salvation you had, being suddenly plunged into a vast ocean before you filled your lungs with air. Anyone in that position would look to escape reality. He regretted not doing more, but he could only blame himself so much. Still, he wondered if he should have at least attended their funeral. He had no idea what he had been thinking back then, but maybe at least look at their faces after they passed. At least have picked up their bones. How did Paul's face look after he passed? It hadn't been satisfaction written on his face, but he did see the edge of his lips curl up into a smile of relief. What did he try to say at the end? What expression did his parents wear when they passed? Why did he look back then? He wished that he can go back now and see. Rudeus felt awful the next day. An intense desire to do nothing weighed on his entire body. To escape, he forced himself to head to the room Lilia and Zenith were in. Lilia stared in amazement. Lord Rudeus, you've recovered already? Yeah, for a moment. I can't be the only one to take it easy, right? I'm certain no one would complain if you were to rest for a bit more. Rudeus really did want to crawl back into bed, but he sensed that he had to do something. He had to move. Please, let me stay here. All right, I understand. Feel free to sit. The two of them watched over Zenith together. She had been sleeping for days by now. 3 days to exit the labyrinth, and a day to return to the town. Outwardly, she seemed perfectly healthy. No sign of losing weight. She merely looked like she was sleeping. Reese thought that she'd look a bit older, but that wasn't the case. Her hands were warm, and you could hear her breathing. The thought of her staying that way forever passed through his mind. Her body deteriorating and her dying. A thought he kept to himself. Rudeus and Lilia watched over her quietly. Viera and Cher would come by to chat, but none of it ever stuck in his head. Alone, Rudeus and Lilia would eat together, even though he had little sense of being hungry, barely swallowing anything and trying to force the food down with water. The food was stuck in his throat and made him gag. Finally, early afternoon, while Rudeus, Lilia, and Viera were there, Zenith showed signs of changing. She let out a small groan and slowly lifted her eyes open. Viera rushed out of the room to inform the others. Lilia and Rudeus watched as Zenith lifted herself up. Being bedridden for days, it was difficult, but Lilia assisted her. Good morning, my lady. Lilia smiled. Zenith regarded her face, not completely shaking off the sleep. It was a voice Rudeus recognized. The same voice that he heard when he was born into this world. A calming one. Relief washed over him. Paul had died, but at least the one that he tried to rescue was safe now. Safe and alive. His hopes, Paul's hopes, were realized. The double whammy. She would be sad to learn of his death. She might even cry, but at least the three of them could share in that loss together. Mother, but that was for later. After things calmed down a bit, and she understood what was going on, one step at a time. It wouldn't be wise to force the harshness of reality on her at once. First, they needed to rejoice that she was alive and they were reunited. They could be sad later. Zenith tilted her head slightly. Rudeus steeled his heart. She had forgotten him, but he couldn't blame her. Same thing happened to Roxy. They were apart for years, and his face had changed. It might be a shock for her now, but they could laugh about it in the years to come. My lady, this is Lord Rudeus. 10 years have passed since you last saw him. Zenith stared vacantly. Looking to Lilia, her eyes were like a mirror, empty, reflecting only what they saw before them. Zenith tilted her head again. Lilia's eyes went wide. Something was wrong. She wasn't speaking. All she did was groan. The way that she moved, it was like she had forgotten Lilia as well. Rudeus was one thing, but Lilia was different. Sure, she aged, but she hadn't changed that much. Her clothes and her hair was the same as before. Her voice was clumsy, eyes blank, and she couldn't form words. All she did was stare at them. My lady, could it be? Lilia realized it too. He knew what she left unspoken, but his heart quickly dismissed it. They tried numerous times to talk to her. The conclusion came quick. Zenith reacted to their voice, but produced no words of her own. She also showed no signs of comprehending what they said. Lord Rudeus, I'm afraid she lost it all. Indeed, Zenith had lost everything. Her memories, knowledge, intelligence, all necessary components that formed a person. She was a husk. There was no way she remembered Paul. She didn't even know Rudeus or Lilia. That meant she couldn't even be sad that Paul died. They couldn't share the loss. The reality of that stabbed like a knife. A gasp escaped Rudeus' throat, and his heart was shattered. He had no clue how many days had passed after that. He woke, slept, woke, slept, countless times. And I'm gonna leave it there. That's pretty much it. Again, he goes in there and sees Zenith and then goes to lay back down. So anything beyond here is probably going to be for the next episode. Looks like I said earlier, I've talked to a few people that I think this next part is like the big part for me. Like of anything that I'm like, please handle this well, it's this next part. There's so much in this next part that I think they can either fumble or they can nail, which they've nailed a lot of these kinds of situations very well so far. So I have hope. And I think this episode, like I said, was really fantastic. But again, I think there's a lot of context that's really, unfortunately, kind of breezed through at the end of this episode that I think you really have to have there. The idea that when Rudeus had the situation with Paul, it's shocking. Like, oh, what happened? Oh, that's right. I was there and he pushed me out of the way. But what's his expression? Oh, wait. Is he smiling? Like there's relief on his face. What is that face? And then immediately when he goes back home, he's like, okay, Lilia says, I'll handle this. He goes into his room and he's thinking about the face. Paul's face. That's why I wanted to cover it in the skip content, even though, again, I think they can technically get a little bit into that stuff in the next episode. There's a lot in the idea of, okay, I just seen Paul's face. What was that face? Oh, my parents from my previous life. Their faces. Why didn't I go see their faces? I was too busy making up excuses why I didn't go to their funeral. I should have at least gone to their funeral, but here's my excuses. I was afraid of people looking at me as a deadbeat, so I didn't go. There's my excuses. Got it. No, I just didn't go. I didn't go, and I probably should have gone to see what their faces look like. What do they think of me? All that kind of stuff is running through his head. But at the end of it all, I need to get out of this room. I think he was saying that because he's afraid he's going to become a shut-in. I need to get out. I'm already sitting in this room for way too long. He goes out, he goes to see Lilia and Zenith. And when he gets in there, he's like, yeah, I need to do something. I got to get up and move. I'm going to become a shut-in again, I think. But when he gets there, the thing there is like, with Zenith, he's thinking, if she just wakes up, this is great because then we can all mourn together. Once she gets back up, we'll let things settle down. We'll give her an idea of the situation. And then we can let her know what happened to Paul. And then the three of us together, Zenith, me, and Lilia, the two wives and the son, we can talk and mourn about Paul. But what happens? Zenith wakes up and she's an empty husk. He no longer has somebody to mourn with. We were supposed to mourn together, but she's empty. All of this was for an empty husk. It's still Zenith, but she's empty. There's nothing there. There's no memories. She doesn't even remember Paul. Doesn't remember us. It makes sense for me because I'm grown older now, but for Lilia, she looks the same. She's got a little bit older, but she looks exactly the same. Hair's done the same. Still wearing the same maid outfit. There's no reason why she wouldn't recognize Lilia. And then nothing comes out of Zenith's mouth. An empty husk. There was no way that she would remember Paul. That meant she couldn't even be sad that Paul died. They couldn't share that loss. The reality stabbed him like a knife. Super tragic. I cannot believe I got through pretty much all of that skip content and stuff without completely breaking, but very, very rough episode. And then I think the next episode is going to be even worse, but we'll see. But hope you guys enjoyed this skip content video and me running through this stuff. And I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, despite the fact that it was as painful as it was. And again, happy Father's Day to all the folks out there. I think it really does fit well with Father's Day, even though it is tragic because we seen a father in this episode. We absolutely seen a father in this episode. He stood up, was badass. Again, I think the anime portrayed his brutality, just rushing in there, going berserk on this thing, and his skill, his ability to save his son multiple times saving his son was fantastic. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, make sure that like button down below, comment, let me know what's thought of the episode. Additionally, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you get all my content. I do news reviews, first impressions, top list if it's anime is pretty much here. Additionally, I do skip content videos for Mushoku Tensei, so if you're anime only, this is the place to be. But additionally, if you want to support this channel more, I have a Patreon link, tips, links, so thanks, membership button down below. Greatly appreciate what it does, and y'all take care. Damn. Lilia's so great. Oh, they're going to do both of them in the same episode.